And while stay-at-home orders and social distancing for the safety of the community are not and should not be cause for constitutional concern, that doesn't mean citizens should not remain vigilant in their protection of their most basic of rights in a time of crisis. Taking our eye off that ball is how we got stuck with constitutional shredding laws like those found in the Patriot Act. And that is why many are starting to raise the alarm over the potential use of U.S. military personnel here at home in the battle against this virus. Newsweek reported recently that the U.S. military is preparing forces to assume a larger role in the coronavirus response, including the controversial mission of quelling civil disturbances and enforcing the law, a mission that the military has not engaged in for almost 30 years. Joining us now to discuss the dangers of deploying the U.S. military here at home in a time of crisis is Netfa Freeman, a member of the Coordinated Committee for the Black Alliance for Peace. Netfa, always a pleasure having you on, sir. Thank you.
Always a pleasure to be on.
So I want to start with just, give people an idea of what are the major potential dangers found in using the U.S. military, not just the National Guard, which is under control of state governors, but the U.S. military, Army, Navy, Air Force, in operations domestically during a time of crisis.
Mm-hmm. Well, these are people who are pretty much trained as to confront enemy combatants, as you will, and really thinking that, or being trained, I guess, to have the disposition that the people that they're fighting or confronting are less worthy of humanity or of life and liberty. And so when you put that on the street, and we have to remember that in the United States, what we refer to as colonized people, black and brown working class people, already live under a police state type of situation. So the danger in what you asked and what you're describing is that they will be combining the mentality that is fostered in military training to fight so-called terrorists and whatever before it used to be communists and people who are not as worthy, combining that with the sort of inherent racist attitudes and classist attitudes of the U.S. police force.
That is a dangerous cocktail.
Netfa, has there been any past examples where the U.S. military was used domestically in a time of crisis? And is there a historical precedence for that kind of deployment?
There's been a few, and so we can look at it's a few. Hurricane Katrina, when that happened, there was a number of people who were scrambling for survival and having to scramble and get whatever they could, and that the military was sent in there. And then some people might not remember how old people are, but we used to see in the media reports of people so-called looting and vandaling, when you're really talking about a dire situation where people are really just trying to scramble for whatever they could to live and survive. And in that instance, that there were really brutal, and had to come out later, brutal instances of people being extrajudicially killed, brutalized by both police and military. In one instance, there was a man who was shot in the back, and then they proceeded to kick him several times, and he died. Other instances are during the Rodney King incident. There were people who the pressure cooker was off after the beating of Rodney King, and a lot of the verdicts were really people felt they didn't like the verdicts. So there were rebellions. We call them rebellions instead of riots, because people were rebelling over centuries of police brutality and not an incident. But in that instance, they also brought the National Guard in. There were fatalities in terms of those exchanges. And then during the rebellions during Dr. King, when Dr. King was assassinated, the same thing happened. And there were also fatalities due to the police and the military mix. And we, black and brown people, get the worst end of those that mix.
It's scary because you see the idea being floated and kind of commonalized, in the language of the media. I mean, with more than a healthy percent of New York City Police Department officers recently reporting sick due to illness or self-quarantine. I think the number's like over 15, and even higher police absentee rates elsewhere. An opinion piece in the Washington Post, pontificated about how active U.S. military members could potentially fill those roles of the police, writing, quote, "They might need to backstop and backfill police forces in hard-hit communities might soon need major assistance with patrolling the streets, enforcing restrictions on movement, deterring crime, and other tasks. You know, this is pretty unbelievable language. Do you believe that this could actually be a realistic possibility given the current state of the country today? Is this something that we could see?
Oh, I think there's no one, they're talking about it. And I think the Washington Post piece you were talking about was co-authored by 3 people, and they were they were a representative of that cocktail mix themselves. The police department, I think it was the New York City Police, and then they're all now are Brookings people, Brookings Institute people, the U.S. Army. I think it was a couple of representatives from the U.S. Army. It was about 3 people who were authors in that article, and that what they're anticipating, and I think there's also historical precedent in that. And when we remember that the rebellions in the 1960s, after the Dr. King, they did a report. They do riot reports every now and then. People to try to figure out the root causes and how to deal with riots or maybe avoid them. And there was called the Kerner Commission Report, 1968. And so one of the things that the report showed, and it was pretty, I think, thoroughly done report, was the type of civil unrest that we can see, the type of dissatisfaction with basic things that we now know are going to be what do you call it? Scarce. We're looking at a 32%. They're predicting a 32% unemployment rate, the biggest ever seen since the Great Depression. There's scarcity of food because of the supply chains of food are being disrupted because of the COVID-19 and the social distancing and people being out of work. The system, the capitalist system, and we have to attribute it to that, is not designed, because we don't see that the same outcome or the same situation in other places, is not designed to handle the type of, or not designed to create the type of cooperation that is needed even on the domestic level, where other countries, people are involved in the organizing process to know how to respond to certain things, and that even to be able to manage things in a way that don't make things scarce, that allow people to go to the supermarket maybe in more distanced, regulated fashion to keep things going. And so here, the powers that be are seeing a threat to the status quo, where people are seeing the inefficiencies or the ineptitude of capitalism, and they don't want that threat to become even more formidable. So instead of feeding people, instead of housing people and things that we're seeing happening as a response to this, but it's not for us that they're doing it for themselves. But that can't last, because that goes against capitalism. So their response would be to send in the military and the police to try to quell dissent.
Well, thankfully, Netfa, we got good folks like you out there keeping an eye on this and educating people on the dangers of that kind of thought. Thank you so much for always coming on, Netfa Freeman. Always a pleasure, sir.
Thank you.